simplifying square roots, or using the square root property to solve quadratic equations. Either way, it would work similarly. So if a is a non-negative number, then the square root of a is the non-negative number we square to get a. We call square root of a the principal square root of a. So let's realize when you say the principal square root, that implies that it's a positive number only. So be aware of that. Positive number only when you say principal square root of a. But in reality, it's not only positive numbers. For instance, if I take the square root of 25, the answer would be 5. But I can actually have a positive or a negative answer. So I'd have to say it's a plus or minus. So let's do a quick check. We can go 5 times 5 and get 25. Or negative 5 times negative 5 will give us also positive 25. Keep in mind, negative times a negative gives us a positive answer. So we could probably use a calculator for reference in this case. So calculator for us. Keep in mind, TI-84 works quite similarly to the TI-83, so be aware of that. We can go 5 times 5 and double check that we get 25. And you want to use the negative sign for this multiplication at the very bottom, right next to your enter button. You should have a negative sign. Otherwise, you're going to get an error. So negative 5 times negative 5. Notice I don't need the parentheses, but you could use the parentheses if you want to. Okay. The other way we could do this is with the square root. If you push second button, and somewhere in the middle on the left side, you'll see an x squared button on the opposite corner of your number 7. So if you push the x squared after you've pressed the second button, you should get a square root. First press the second, and then the square will give you the square root. You'll notice the sign right there on top of the x squared. So in this case, we want to do 25 and close your parentheses. Notice that your calculator gives you 5. But once again, your calculator only gives you the principal square root. In other words, only the positive numbers. Whenever you're taking the square root of an even number, or I should say an even root, you only get the positive from your calculator. Assume you need a plus or minus. So in other words, if we try the 64, second, then the x squared button will give you the square root of 64, which gives you 8. Or you once again can go back to recall your multiplications, right? 8 times 8 will give you 64. And once again, let's keep in mind that it could be positive or negative. So positive or negative, let's do a quick check once again. That way we can see that it does work. 8 times 8 gives us positive 64. And likewise, negative 8 times negative 8, negative times negative gives you a positive, right? 8 times 8, 64. So we still get a positive 64. So something to be aware of. All right. So finding square roots then. Examples. We have A, square root of 16, B, square root of negative 16, C, negative square root of 16, D, negative square root of negative 16. So if you're having trouble finding the square roots, try graphing y equals x squared and look at the table. The x value is the value that is squared and the y value is the result. Note that the square root sign is called a radical sign. So before we try that, let me bring in a little bit of extra information. So there's your radical sign or your square root sign. Be aware of this. Radical sign means all roots, not just square roots. In this case, if you don't see a number on it, assume it's a square root. Meaning, if I put a number on there, I'll put a 2 to show that it's a square root. But I don't have to. Notice all my examples up above there do not have a number 2 on top of that root sign. So that it still implies that it's a square root. So something to be aware of. Anytime you have any root that is square root or squared root format, you don't need a 2. But any other root format, you do need a number. For instance, if I'm trying to do a cube root, I must show a 3, otherwise you're going to assume it's a cube root, or pardon me, square root. So anything else, I must show a root. So cube root, fourth root, I'll show a 4, fifth root, a 5, etc. But square roots are the only ones that you don't need to show a root under. Alright, so in that case, we were about to try our calculator for reference. So, plugging in our calculator, let me bring our calculator, here you go, you can turn it on. But if you go to y equals, very top left button on your calculator, y equals, you see this menu. And we're going to graph x squared. So x variable right next to your alpha button, you should see an x variable. It's labeled as x, t, theta, and n. Right next to your alpha button, right next to your second button. So there's our x button. Below your clear button, you'll find your caret key. So there is your caret key. That's what it looks like. If you have a T84, you may not see a caret key. Instead, you may see a raise up, which is technically the same. I'll put it true. If you choose to add more afterwards for T84s, you have to push down. T83s, you don't. You can keep going just the way it is for now. But you may need parentheses, etc. But for now, x squared is what we're trying to graph. So I'll go to zoom, and I'll go to zoom standard, option number 6. I'll push the number 6 on my calculator, and that automatically zooms into zoom standard. There it is. This is what x squared looks like to us. But be aware of it. We're not using all of it. So something to think about it. So if I push second, and now my graph button at the top right, so second and graph, gives me the table. And there we go. I can see the negative values that I would get, but I won't worry about the negatives for now. I'll talk about the negatives in a few minutes, or maybe in another video, depending on the case, but more than likely in a few minutes. So if I take 0 in the square, 0 times 0 is 0, 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 4 is 16, 5 times 5 is 25, 6 times 6 is 36, etc. So as you can tell, hey, do we have a 16 on there? Yes, there we go. 4 is what gives us 16. 4 times 4 will give us 16. There it is. Agreed? X value and the y value. So y value is what you are taking the square root of. The result, in this case, going opposite direction, would be your x. Okay, so now that we tried that, let's try the problems. So a, square root of 16, one number times itself gives you 16. We kind of saw earlier again. So 4 times 4 will give us 16. Agreed? Otherwise, you can do by trial and error. 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 4 is 16. There we go, that would be it, right? And let's remember, in your calculator, you're going to get a positive value because it's the square root. So therefore, we need a plus or minus added to that. Cube roots, you don't need to add a plus or minus typically, but I'll talk about that in a future video. But for square roots, you do. Any even root, even number root, square root, fourth root, sixth root, eighth root, 10th root, 12th root, you need a plus or minus. Odd number roots, you don't. Okay, so B. If we try taking the square root of negative 16, hey, what do we get in our calculators? Well, we tried, well, we don't get a negative 16 here, right? So let's see, where do I get a negative 16? Well, even at negative 4, I get positive 16. So I don't get a negative 16. Let me clear this out. So let me go back to my main screen, or I push second, right next to is the mode button. It'll take you back to your main screen. And let's take the square root, be our calculator format. So second, and you'll see a square button somewhere in the left side, middle of the left keyboards or keys. And you can push the square button, which will give you the square root. So second, x squared gives you the square root. And if I type in negative, you have to use the button at the very bottom, right next to your enter button. That's your negative sign. So 6, close your parentheses, and hit enter. Hey, what happened? Did I do this wrong? No, look at the top. It says error, not a real answer. So in other words, we can't take the square root of a negative number. Hence the reason why in the previous problem for A, we got plus or minus. Because we won't be able to get a negative 16. We only get a plus or minus. Keep in mind from the previous view that we had. Okay, so continuing on. Therefore, because our negative is inside the radicand, inside the square root, so our answer becomes a non-real result. We can't do it. We get a non-real result. We'll worry about imaginary values later on in case you're wondering about those if you've seen them before. If you haven't, do not worry about them at all. So C, square root, well, negative square root of 16. Notice there is no negative inside the radicand, so the square root of 16 That's 4, agreed? Let's realize that that would be negative plus or minus 4 because of the square root. Well, that has no effect, you may think. Yeah, for some classes it does. So depending on who your instructor is, it may. Okay? From my point of view, it's not as critical, at least for this level of mathematics. So be aware of that. But for higher level of mathematics, and depending on your career, it might make a difference. So in this case, as you multiply a negative times a positive, it will give us a negative. And as you multiply a negative times a negative on the bottom, it becomes a positive. So essentially, it flips your sign. It switches the order of your sign. You get a minus plus instead of plus minus, as we did in problem or example A. So that's our answer in this case, minus plus. D, we have the square root of, well, negative square root of negative 16. Let's realize there's a negative in the radicand, just like B. So in this case, no matter what we do, we can't do it because of the negative inside the radicand. Not the one on the outside, but the one on the inside. So that one there. Okay, so therefore it's going to give us, once again, an unreal result. So we wouldn't be able to do it in this case.